Well, we're still working on track plans, and today we have something fun, huge classification yards. Last week we talked about the smaller stub-ended yards. This week we're talking about these gigantic, quite often double-ended classification yards. Of course, the real railroads have this need to build up trains for certain destinations and then dismantle them at certain locations and reassemble them into different trains headed for different locations. So classification yards out of necessity are just absolutely gigantic. And if you tried to model an entire classification yard like this one, you'd have to have something the size of a giant warehouse, and all your railroad would consist of is a classification yard. And that wouldn't be very fun or interesting, frankly. And yet there is a need to have such yards on your model railroad. What we're looking at here is the Barstow, California classification yards of the BNSF. We flew a drone over the yards, and yes, the railroad security did come up and talk to us about that. Fortunately, they were fans of the channel and said, just land your drone and go away. Now we can see a train on the move here leaving the yard. We can see that these more central tracks are set up to be departure tracks. They also have destination tracks depending on which direction the train is coming from. And then once the trains are on the arrival or departure tracks, they can be dismantled on the other tracks and then reassembled back onto the departure track ready to leave town. Now, while we're more or less focused right now on this central yard, notice that there's a complete second classification yard off to our right, an engine facility more centrally located directly in front of us, and a complete other classification yard off in the distance, a hump yard. And even though this is a prototype facility, they too have to compress the amount of space being utilized here so that it's not even larger than it already is. And one of the things they're doing is, instead of having a single ladder track, breaking the tracks out here almost like you'd see branches on a tree. And that utilizes the space more efficiently. Whereas at the other end of the yard, they are relying on one very large ladder track in this area. Notice that, just as we talked about with the stub siding, it's paralleled by a runaround. So keep in mind that all of these classification yards are very organic, based on the needs of the switching yard as well as the real estate footprint that's available. Off in the distance here, we can see a whole different kind of classification yard. It's a hump yard where freight cars are allowed to roll down this hill and then down the ladder track and be directed into individual tracks from the control tower, which is located here. Hump yards are really fascinating, something really interesting to see in operation. Very difficult to model. I've seen a few people model them with some success, but the physics on a miniature railroad are so different than the physics on an actual railroad that the idea of rolling freight cars freely down a hill and then directing them into various tracks is, well, it's just much more difficult to do on a model railroad. So the whole idea of even modeling a classification yard, unless you have some specific need for it, given the amount of space it's going to take up, most people would choose not to model a very large classification yard unless they're like me and they just like building all kinds of rolling stock. And once you've got 150 blue box Athearn cars, where are you going to keep those things? So you almost need to have some sort of facility like this on your model railroad just to house all of your stuff. But let's keep in mind that one solution to this is to build your classification yard underneath the railroad a hidden staging yard so that you have some way to keep all of this stuff, but not necessarily occupying a giant footprint on your model railroad. It can be hidden underneath the railroad and still function as a staging yard for bringing out all of the blue box Athearn cars that you've built over the years. In this case, you're not actually operating the yard as a classification yard so much as just a place to park things, because access to it is very limited, but it is functioning just as a place to stage trains so that they can come out from the hidden yard onto the main line. So let's take a look at a couple of classification yards on actual model railroads. This is Verl Fosnight's Union Pacific Wyoming division in Cornville, Arizona. And because it's such a huge railroad in a dedicated building, he's able to have several classification yards. But even still, he has to compress them for space. Here's the track plan of the upper level, and what we're looking at right now is this switching yard right here, the Laramie switching yard. And you can see that it's built onto a curved section of the railroad. Because again, a classification yard takes up so much space, you may have to make compromises like building it on a curved section of the railroad as opposed to a straight section. Also tucked into this space we have the Laramie locomotive shops and coaling tower. It's really a neat section on the railroad. Over here we have the largest facility on the railroad, Cheyenne. Cheyenne exists on both the upper and lower levels. This is the switching yard on the upper level, and over here we have the Cheyenne roundhouse and engine facilities. On the lower level in this same area we have the passenger facilities. So this is the Cheyenne Depot and all of the passenger tracks for the Cheyenne Depot. And yet another classification yard over here. I think Verl said that they have something on the order of 2,000 pieces of rolling stock, and I forget how many hundred locomotives. So he sort of needs this kind of space just to house all of this stuff. And over here, yet another facility, the Green River Classification Yard and Engine Shops. So when we look at the entire railroad, both levels, you can see just how much of this railroad is tied up by classification yards and engine facilities. And needless to say, this is where a lot of the operating takes place as well. But when you're a spectator on such a railroad, you tend to be much more interested in places like this, just open areas where the trains are free running down a double track through Wyoming. But every railroad is unique, and it's unique to the person building it and the way they like to enjoy their railroad. Let's take a look at another railroad. This is the Golden Spike Model Railroad Club in Salt Lake City. And you can see that they have one classification yard centrally located where they can actually build up and dispatch trains. And as a space-saving technique, they've decided to do a stub-ended switching yard, as we talked about last week. It takes up a lot less space because you only have to have ladder tracks at one end. They've also done a clever thing here by utilizing two separate ladder tracks coming off of a Y so that trains can be pulled in here from either direction and then down two separate ladder tracks, all to save space. And then the dead space, if you will, on either side of the ladder tracks can be utilized as an engine facility and or caboose tracks. Now, as we mentioned last week, if you're going to have a stub-ended yard, you also have to have some runaround capability so that a train that's pulled in here can have its locomotive detached from the train, and the locomotive can then run around the train to get out of the switching yard. Otherwise, it would be trapped in here. It's interesting to note, too, that while on their original track plan they only had this runaround on the central two tracks, in the actual construction they've added 2 more runarounds on the outermost tracks. So they must have decided that they needed more runaround capability than just the 2 central tracks. This design really is great for a model railroad club like this because the members of the club have access to both sides of the yard so that they can bring their own equipment in and set it here in the yards, switch that out into trains, and then head out onto the high iron. By contrast, Verl's Railroad is set up as a single owner where all of the equipment on the railroad stays with the railroad at all times, and so it makes much more sense to have a lot of different places to keep the equipment where it will simply reside until it's being used. Now, most of us aren't going to have a railroad anything like that. We're going to have something more like this. This is a deeply folded dog bone, if you remember our discussion on railroad footprint. If you look closely, yes, this is a dog bone. It's a folded dog bone. It's just very deeply folded. And it has the facilities here for running 3 trains continuously on 3 completely isolated tracks, the blue line, the black line, and the red line. It has some switching capabilities, the green lines, and over here we have an actual switching yard. Notice that there isn't a yard lead, as we talked about, so you're not going to be able to switch this yard without blocking the black main line. There's also no runaround capability, so if you're going to be switching these 3 tracks, you're going to have to do that with a train that's running around the black line in a clockwise direction. And if you want to spot cars over here, that will have to be done with a train on the black main line that's running around in a counterclockwise direction so that it can pull down in here and then back the cars into this stub siding. But clearly the intent here, rather than switching or that kind of operations, is to simply have fun running trains continuously on your 3 isolated loops. Well, I hope you found this informative and possibly even entertaining, and I hope if you're enjoying this series that you will want to be a subscriber to the channel. And the easy way to do that is by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you did not find it boring, and Karen and I will see you here on Sunday. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.